wanted to share some reflections on political stress and looking at that, how it impacts us both psychologically, but also in our pursuit of trying to be a good, responsible citizen. Political stress is something that has become increasingly common. Over much of my career as a psychologist, for example, politics rarely came up in the psychotherapy room. However, in the last 8 to 9 years, it's come up quite frequently. There's always been some periods of political stress, and it might come up occasionally around the election cycle, but it now comes up pretty regularly for people quite often, and it's a significant psychological issue. This is something I see with family members, that I see with friends and colleagues, that I see with students, that I see with clients that I work with. So political stress, I think, is something that is a big concern right now, both mentally, but also as far as how this is impacting our political and social process. I'm doing this video as we're nearing an important election that is coming up. And so it's a time that a lot of people are experiencing very heightened political stress. I want to begin by talking about what are some of the ways that we can manage political stress. And after this, I want to talk about why it is important for us to manage our political stress in order to be a better citizen, to use our kind of responsibilities as a citizen well. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is saturation. When I say saturation, what I am talking about is when we reach a point of having gained enough information about what's happening that we're not really getting anything new. If you watch a lot of the major news networks, there's a point where they start just recycling the stories. There might be occasionally a little new commentary after it, but it's not really anything new. When we get to that point, it's generally good to stop. Then continuing to watch is not going to add much to our information. It's not going to add much to our understanding of the problem, but it is likely to cause us stress. And frequently, after that point of saturation, it actually becomes more stressful to keep taking in that information. So stopping when we reach that point of saturation, putting the news away for a while, is generally going to be good. This can be difficult because today there are so many different news sources, and they might have just a slightly different wrinkle in the way they present something, or a slightly different angle, but it still is not really adding anything significantly new. We also are getting bombarded by it from so many sources. For many of us on our phones, every few minutes something new is popping up about what is happening, particularly during these election cycles. And so it's tempting to each time just click on that and read, even if it's going to be a lot of that same information. Similarly, on social media, we're bombarded by news sources. And so when we're bombarded by news sources, it's easy to just continue following these and go down a rabbit hole with those, but it's not a healthy rabbit hole, and it doesn't help us become a better citizen. The second thing that I think is important for us to consider is the more extreme and polarized positions. Now, is a difference between extremism and polarization, though unfortunately these often get used interchangeably. Extreme might be having a strong perspective looking to the right, or a strong perspective from the left. That's not necessarily polarized. Kirk Schneider distinguishes these and then says that polarization is the adherence to one perspective with the disregard or discounting or not considering or ignoring of any other competing perspectives. So one can be on the far right or far left and be quite open to listening openly to other perspectives. Now, there's a tendency, the further we are to the right or left, for there to be less of that openness to listening to different perspectives. But it can still be there. That it's still possible to consider those when we're not polarized. So these extreme and polarized perspectives, there's a lot more news sources that represent those. And typically, these news sources are less accurate in the information that they're providing. They've not, it's often a lot more opinion and speculation than it is news that has been that is credible and has been fact checked, and the sources have really been confirmed as being good, accurate sources. So, with these extreme perspectives, and the two most popular that I will pick on some then is MSNBC and Fox News. For both of these, what you're going to see is they really show one perspective primarily. They'll give some consideration to other perspectives, but normally it is to either discount them, make fun or joke about them, sensationalize them to make them sound a lot more dangerous than what they are, or it can be um, showing really less well stated perspectives of the other perspective. So what we often see is these are really inaccurate, misleading news sources. If you get your news primarily from these, some of the research suggests you may not have as accurate of an understanding and you may not be as informed about what's actually happening in the world as if you get your news from other sources. Now, if you like those stations, it's not saying you need to completely get rid of them, but you should be cautious with them because they are more extreme. So one of the things that can decrease political stress is by looking for more balanced and neutral sources. Now there's two sides of this though. The balanced and neutral sources, they tend to create some feelings of discomfort too. So if you are um, further to the right or left, or if you're strongly supporting a candidate on one of the other perspectives, a more neutral source is going to be critical of both sides, of both perspectives, and shouldn't just say both, but of multiple different perspectives. And that is actually a fairly healthy thing. That's a healthy type of tension. You know, if a candidate we're supporting says something that really was not well thought out, we should have some discomfort with that. If we just are always looking to how can we justify or support our candidate instead of saying, all right, they made a mistake there, then we're probably slipping into that polarized perspective that's not very healthy. All candidates are going to make some mistakes. And if we're really critically thinking on our own, we should have some points of disagreement with every candidate, no matter how much you support them. If you agree with everything that any candidate states, that should be a big red flag of concern. So these neutral sources, while they do create some tension because they're a little bit more balanced sometimes, overall they tend to create less stress for people than when we watch these more extreme and polarized perspectives. So it's good to avoid the saturation, avoid the more extreme polarized. And then the third one really goes with that extreme polarized is the sensationalized headlines and sensationalized reporting. We see this regularly. When you see these dramatic words in headlines, we should be cautious right away. As soon as we see these dramatic words, when we see these emotional pleas, often what we're going to find is a couple things. One, if you go and read what actually happened from that headline, it's not often as bad as what it sounds by that headline. The headlines, they're there to suck us in. They're trying to get us to read something. So they overstate something, they use emotion, they dramatize, they try and get our curiosity to suck us in to read something, but it's not often as accurate. Frequently, the more boring headlines are going to be more accurate. Now, there's exceptions to those, particularly in our current political climate, because we just have to be honest here. There are some really bizarre things that are happening in our political climate right now. And there's some very bizarre, unusual things that are being said and presented as truth without any basis. And so, you know, we are seeing some very unusual political times right now. And some of this is because what we're seeing is there's just so many more news sources, and more of these news sources are more extreme. The more neutral and balanced news sources, they seem to be uh, harder to find these days, but there are some of them out there. But what we're also seeing is a lot of these sources that are much less balanced are getting harshly criticized from both people on the far left and the far right, or even moderate left and moderate right, because it's not agreeing with them. But because something doesn't agree with all of your political perspectives, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. These less biased news sources. And what good news does is it provides you the information. It might provide you some of the thinking from different perspectives, but it encourages you to make your own decision on it. The news sources that are trying to tell you what you should think, you should be skeptical of. And right now, what we're seeing is often the opposite: is people are being skeptical of the news sources that don't tell you what to think, but they might make you a little comfortable because it disagrees with what a candidate or a party that you're affiliated with is telling you this is what you should think. There should be some discomfort in politics. That's healthy. We should embrace that. So when we look at these things, then the sensationalized extreme, the oversaturation with news, one of the most powerful tools that we have then is fact checking, and looking at not just fact checking of specific incidents, but the fact checking more generally of news sources. One of the sources that I find to be really helpful, there's a few that have put out things and they're all pretty similar in what they come to, but one of them is Media Bias Fact Check. And one of the things that Media Bias Fact Check does is it looks at a lot of the different news sources. It doesn't have all of them up there, but it's regularly adding some. And it looks at the news sources and it rates them on the bias, right, left bias, and on factual reporting. Is it low, medium, high, very high? And this is very useful. So anytime that I see an article from a news source that I'm not familiar with, I shouldn't say anytime, but almost any time, most of the time, if I'm not familiar with that news source, what I'll often do is go to Media Bias Fact Check, and I will look up on there the information on it. If it's far left and unfactual, or far right and not very factual, I don't even bother reading it because I know it's probably not going to be very accurate information on there, or not very trustworthy information, even if it is accurate. So something can be accurate and not trustworthy. But what I mean by trustworthy is that it's done its due diligence to look at the sources, to consider the sources, to do its own fact checking. So when you look at these, at the fact checking of the sources, and you try and get the least biased, which is either they have a least biased category, or the center right and center left. If you try and get most of your news from those sources with and sources that are also rated as high factual, that's where you're going to typically get the most accurate information on the news. And then you can make your own positions on that. But particularly if you see that low factual rating, then you need to be questioned. You need to question it. Now, you might find that there's some far left and far right sources that their factual reporting is actually fairly good yet. But again, what we're seeing increasingly is a lot of the more polarized and extreme views are not very accurate, and so we need to be really cautious with them. But so fact checking the news sources is important. Now, again, watch your bias there, because a lot of people, if you're on the left and you see something rated as neutral because you disagree with some of the perspectives on there, need to really consider, is that because of where you're sitting as far as your place on that spectrum, or is it because it's not accurate on there? Now, next, it's also important to do specific fact checking. The fact checking industry has just grown, and a lot of different news sources are putting in fact checking. But you're going to see a difference between fact checking by MSNBC and Fox News and what you're going to see by the nonpartisan um, the nonpartisan sources for fact checking, such as PolitiFact and FactCheck.com. There's a few of these out there that they're nonpartisan. Now, even the nonpartisan ones will make mistakes. But what you're going to find is they're going to be fact checking both sides. When you look at MSNBC and Fox News, they're going to just fact check the other side. And while sometimes it's very accurate yet, sometimes it's not, but while sometimes it's very accurate yet, it's not going to be balanced. It's just going to be fact checking one way or the other. So with your fact check sources, you want to see, is it balanced? Is it fact checking both sides to it? And does it show its evidence? Why it came to these conclusions? If it doesn't do those things, you need to be a little bit skeptical about them. But there's a couple ways in that we can use the fact check. One of my favorite is I start off almost every day reading a number of the fact checks. And what I find this does is when I've read the fact checks, then I see these sensationalized headlines all over the place during the day. I go into them recognizing that, okay, this isn't worth my time. This is a sensationalized headline. It's not likely very accurate. Now, again, we do want to maybe look at some of those perspectives at times, but still be cautious with them. So by reading the fact checks, I find that a lot of the headlines do not impact me as much. They don't cause as much stress. They don't cause as much of an emotional reaction to them. So reading the fact checks often before going into the news, that is one thing that can really help with it. Now, sometimes it takes a few days for the fact checks to check things that you might have been seeing in the headlines. So this doesn't always capture all of that, but hopefully it'll help. Now, the second thing is anytime you see a more extreme or sensationalized thing, or anytime you just find yourself having a strong emotional reaction to things, do a fact check. What you might find is you're getting stressed out over nothing. Now, again, try and make sure you're using good, nonpartisan, non biased fact checks, keeping in mind that even those are going to make some mistakes at times. But when you do that, instead of spending a day going down a rabbit hole, or even an hour or half hour going down a rabbit hole looking at some of these things, what we can do is we can get accurate information and we can see, is this really worth my emotional reactivity and my stress? And I think frequently you'll come to the conclusion it's not. So these are four ways that we can reduce our political stress: Sat- avoiding saturation, oversaturation, avoiding more extreme and polarized sources, avoiding the sensationalized sources, and using fact checks appropriately. But keep in mind, some political stress is normal, even healthy. When we live in a democracy, we should experience some political stress, but we want to keep it from overwhelming us. And part of why we want to keep it from overwhelming us is because when we're overwhelmed by political stress and when we develop this reactivity to all of these headlines, we tend to not be as good of a citizen. Let me explain that a little bit. As our stress goes up and as our emotion goes up, we often tend to be more easily brought in to different perspectives. We might we might follow certain sources much more because they're the sources that we agree with, and that gives the appearance of comfort, as we've talked before. We also tend to become more antagonistic to other perspectives, and we might become polarized, blocking off these other perspectives because they're increasing our stress some. So by lowering our stress and using these more balanced sources, we can be a better citizen. And again, we want to use sources that are providing us with information, exposing us to some different perspectives, but encouraging us to come to our own conclusion. Whenever you have a source, again, I really want to emphasize this, whenever you have a source that is telling you how you should think about something, you need to be suspicious. That's not being a good citizen. Being a good citizen requires us to critically think and consider different perspectives. We can do that even from a pretty extreme perspective on the right or the left. So it's not extremism that's the problem. It is polarized extremism, reactive extremism, and extremism where we're not thinking through things. The thinking through things is important. If you can fact check the other side, but you can't fact check your own, that's a concern. If you're unwilling to fact check one of your own candidates, or if you always agree with your candidate over the fact checkers, you need to really reflect on what that means for you, both as being a citizen, but also what does that mean for your psychological health. You also want to look at a little bit of, are you being manipulated by the political process and by a lot of these statements with it? As what we're seeing is, if we're honest, as we come up on the election we're coming up on right now, we're seeing misinformation from both sides. Now, I do want to come back to one thing with the fact checks about that. There are some people that get upset with the fact checks because they might look at it, well, in one day they're fact checking one candidate more than the other. Well, now some of that is going to be just by the context. So after the Republican National Convention, there was a lot more fact checking of Republicans for a few days after that. After the Democratic National Convention, there was a lot more fact checking of the Democrats after that. So you're going to see these come and go. Some of the fact check organizations, what they choose to focus on fact checking is partially influenced by people contacting them, asking them to fact check something. And with some of these sources, I believe PolitiFact is one of them. You can actually email and they will frequently give you a fact check response to it, even if it's not published. And sometimes that might end up getting published. But they base it on what's being requested. So that's one of the things that drives them, some of them in some cases. But also, we just have to be honest here. There are some candidates that are going to be that are less honest, that make up things a lot more frequently, and they're going to get fact checked a little bit more. And so, if you do see a candidate that's getting a lot more negative fact checks, and it's by one of these nonpartisan sources, you really need to think about what that means. Yeah, we should make sure that it's not that the fact checking sources become more biased, but we also need to really think, are we unwilling to consider the facts? That's so important in being a good citizen. There are times where we're going to be passionate about something, and if we're honest, we're going to find out that, all right, the evidence just really doesn't support what I am advocating or what I want to believe. If you don't have that experience, then you're probably not being a very responsible citizen. So I hope that this information is helpful for you, one, in managing your stress through difficult political seasons, but also, and I think this is important when we think about our social and even national health, I hope that it can help you become a better citizen and to really think through these issues, to recognize where are the places where maybe I'm not being as good a citizen as what I need to be, and use this information to become a better citizen. Right now, we need very desperately in the United States good citizens who are critically thinking, using good sources, willing to fact check, willing to reconsider their perspectives, willing to reconsider the perspectives of their candidate, and willing to advocate on important issues based from a credible position that's been well thought through.